Let's talk about some best practices when building up MVC applications. Most of these tips will address maintaining each of the MVC layer's responsibilities. That's one of the keys of the MVC, is that each one of the layers have specific responsibilities. And if you've seen the course on Solid, a given class has a single responsibility. These layers also are limited in what they should do. So views should only contain presentation code. There shouldn't be any business logic in them. So there shouldn't be any heavy duty validation or any of that kind of thing. There also shouldn't be any database queries. The model is the layer that contains the business logic. So it contains the data layer interface, the validation logic, and the business rules. And the controllers are responsible for the input validation, and that's just checking to make sure that the validation follows the correct patterns. For instance, a required parameter, a range check perhaps, or even a regex, but not a complicated validation logic that involves the business rules. The controllers are responsible for retrieving data from the model and returning the appropriate view or redirecting to another appropriate action. So, keeping these things in mind, we'll take a look at each one of the layers and take a look at some best practices for each one of them. So, for the model, consider creating a model for each view. Don't try to share a model between views. What inevitably happens is one of the views expands, adds a feature, and changes the model. So the model is no longer appropriate for the other view, and you may or may not remember that the other view is using the same model, and you may end up creating a bug because of that. And at that point, you'll end up having to create the second model anyway. So just creating a model for each view will probably save you some time there. You might also consider just using view model classes. And view model classes just do the data binding. They're effectively storage classes. They don't have any logic behind them. And those might be the classes that you use in your views. That doesn't mean that the model as an overall layer doesn't have any validation rules or business rules. It just means that the particular classes that the view uses for the model just are storage classes just for data binding. The model layer as a whole should definitely contain the business logic. So that is the validation rules, update rules, calculations, search algorithms. Basically, the model has a lot of the guts of the logic of the application, really most of it. And in that, you should be careful with individual classes doing too much. Again, going back to solid principles, you want to take a look at single responsibility. And this is another reason why you might consider using view model classes in addition to business object classes. The model should not have any presentation code. You often see where people will generate HTML in the model or the controller or even store it in the database. Please don't do that. I'm actually currently working on a project where HTML is stored in the database. It's not a good thing. In the future, you may need to support different UI platforms, maybe a mobile native application that doesn't use HTML. So now what do you do with the HTML that's in the database? Parse it and figure out something else? It's not good. So put HTML where it belongs, in the view. And consider using a separate assembly for the model. That'll actually help enforce your separation of concerns. Also, consider using the entity framework or link to SQL, and that'll help clean up the code a bit and keep some of the SQL strings out of it. Moving on to the view. The focus of the view is presenting data. Now, this is where the HTML, jQuery, whatever you're going to use in terms of presentation should be. And we do like some complexity to our web pages at times, although that's not necessarily the current trend. But do use shared views or partial views or HTML helpers anytime you see something that's being used relatively often throughout your application. It's the idea of using user controls or master pages or just widgets in general, just reuse of common elements. It will simplify your page view and it'll also give you some reuse so you don't have to go tracing through each view that has a certain feature to it. In your views, try to use the model data as opposed to the view bag. The model data will provide some type safety that the view bag does not. Moving on to the controller. It's a little bit of a dead horse, but don't put HTML in the controller. Don't put SQL in the controller as well. HTML is in the view and SQL is in the model. The controller is really for managing traffic flow, so HTML and SQL are not appropriate for the controller. Return explicitly named views. By default, the naming convention when you return view with no parameters is slash views slash controller slash action. If I have a products controller and an action called update, by default, my view, when I return a view without a parameter name, will be under views, products, update. That may not be what I want, and it's not explicit. It's a little bit of a magic string. And if I change the action name later on and don't realize that I have a view named that has to be changed as well, that can cause some trouble. So instead, use the return view with a parameter for the view name, and that will decouple that view name from the action name. And remember that view name is the file name of the view. And 404 errors can be avoided a little bit by implementing handle unknown action in the controller. So you can return a default or an error view as opposed to the generic 404 error page. You can also add a handle error attribute on any action and return an error view instead of a more generic 500 error. Also on the controller, you can use a thing called a post redirect get pattern, or a PRG. You've probably seen this all the time. When you're on a web page that is basically doing a post, so you're submitting some data on the web page to the server, and you get impatient because it appears to be hung or something, and you hit refresh, and you'll get that warning about, oh, do you want to resubmit your data? And if you actually do say, yeah, sure, go ahead, then you may be submitting duplicate data. And I'm sure you've seen that a ton in very well-known web pages. One way to avoid that is to use the PRG pattern. And what that essentially does is you return a redirect to action and pass in an action name. This will result in an HTTP 302 or temporary redirect, and it will generate a get on your action name. So the user, if they refresh, won't see that nasty resubmit warning, and you won't get duplicate data. So those are some best practices for the model view and controller. Now, this is just to clear up a little bit of confusion that some people have about view bag, view data, and temp data. So we'll talk about view bag and view data first. These two are used to pass data from the controller to the view. They're gone on the redirect, so it's basically a one-shot. The view data is a dictionary of objects, while view bag is a dynamic property. So that means that view data requires typecasting and null checks, whereas the view bag doesn't require typecasting. Null checks are still good. So you might prefer view bag just for that one reason. But remember, these are very, very temporary, which is somewhat ironic because temp data is slightly less temporary than the view bag and the view data. Temp data is also a dictionary of objects, so you need to be concerned about typecasting and null checks, but it's valid for the full HTTP request, which means it survives redirects. It doesn't survive anything beyond that original request, but it does survive redirects. So it's one step more permanent than the view bag or view data. So you can pass data from controller to controller on a redirect or from action to action. Internally, it does use session to survive across redirects, but it is not as permanent as a normal session object. So you still have to use session if you're trying to go from page to page and keep things throughout a user session. So those are the different life cycles of the different kind of data storage that you have available in MVC. And those are some best practices as well. And I hope that will make your life a little bit easier when you're creating those kind of web applications.